If we ever owned the land, we own it still, for we never sold it. Chief Joseph Nez Perce. The big question: how did European exploration and settlement of what is now the United States change the way Native Americans lived? A long and winding road. Imagine you were born 300 years ago on America's Great Plains. Back then, there were no big cities or highways. The landscape reveals only wide-open prairies with rolling hills, lazy rivers, and endless grassland. Imagine the prairie is your home. Perhaps you are a young Sioux. This is where you were born, and you already know that you will live here all your life. Everything you need to survive is here, amid the grasses and low rolling hills. Food, shelter, clothing, water, fire, friends, family, and sacred places. Everything is here for you. However, even if the prairie contains everything you need to survive, where on the grassy plains do you find food? What do you use to build a house or make a fire? Where do you find water? How can you survive the frigid, icy winters and the scorching summers? The answers to these questions are easy to find as long as you are willing to learn from those who came before you. The people, your people, have been here for some 10,000 years or more. The wisdom and stories of hundreds of generations is your birthright, the most precious thing you will ever own. The elders tell you stories. They teach you about your place in the world, and they provide the wisdom that is passed down from one generation to another. Your ancestors were the first to walk this land, and they learned to survive here with only their brains, muscles, and courage to sustain them. They were the first to hear the winds and see the waving grass. They found the rivers. You believe their spirits are in the hills and grassy plains and in the soil beneath your feet. Most importantly, your ancestors learned to track and hunt the buffalo. The buffalo provide food, shelter, clothing, fuel for fires, and tools. Out here on the Great Plains, your tribe and all the tribes of the Great Plains depend on the buffalo for survival. American buffalo, bison, on plain. The tribes of the Great Plains are certainly not alone in the Americas. There are others, and if you walk far enough in any direction, you will find them. North, south, east, or west, there are different tribes in every habitable place. Over thousands of years, they have learned to survive. Native American tribes lived in every habitable place. In the Southwest, you will meet the Navajo, Pueblo, and all the other tribes of the canyons and deserts. Head southeast, and you will find the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole thriving in the humid woods and swamplands. In the dense, chilly forests to the northeast, there are the Huron and the Six Nations of the Great Iroquois Confederacy. To the west, on the dry, flat plateau between the snowy peaks of the Teton and Cascade Mountains, you will meet Shoshone and Nez Perce. Farther west, where trees grow as tall as mountains, you may meet the Chinook, the Pomo, and all the other tribes nestled along the western coast. Some of the people you meet will be your friends. You will share stories, and you will trade with them. Some of them will be your enemies, just as they were enemies to your grandparents and great-grandparents, and they will want to fight. This is the way it has always been, and so you will need to be prepared if you travel from your homeland. If you are like most Native Americans living on the Great Plains, you will find that you are quite happy to stay and live with your family and friends, the members of your tribe. You do not need to wander too far from home. You will live here on the plains forever, tracking and hunting the buffalo, raising children of your own and teaching them how to live according to the ways of your ancestors. Life is just fine here on the plains. You have everything you need and little changes until it does. Exploration and settlement. The year 1492 CE is a notable date in history, especially American history. Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain in that year to look for a passage to Asia, because that is what he thought he would find across the Atlantic Ocean. Instead, he bumped into a new continent. Columbus's voyage triggered what some call an age of discovery. He was just one of many, many explorers from Spain, England, France, and other European countries to travel across the Atlantic. At first, the Europeans did not know what to call this land. Some called it the West Indies because they thought it was part of Asia. Later, they named it the Americas, after an Italian explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, who figured out it really was a new continent, or more precisely, two new continents, North and South America. Many Europeans simply referred to it as the New World because it was not on any of their maps, and everything seemed strange and new to them. For Europeans, this new world promised not only new lands, but also incredible riches: gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, lumber, animal furs, and a host of other resources. European nations sent armies to fight over these riches, and they sent settlers to harvest them. As you probably know, Columbus was not the first person to find the Americas. European explorers and settlers encountered people everywhere they went. These were the original or native people of the Americas because they had lived on this land before anyone else. Some Europeans called them Indians, although they were not really in the Indies at all. The name stuck, and that is why you hear the term American Indian today. Beginning in 1492 CE, many things began to change for the indigenous peoples of North and South America. For some, the change came quickly. This was especially true in places such as Mexico and Peru, where the Aztec and Inca empires ruled. Their civilizations fell quickly to Spanish conquerors. The Spanish brought their powerful guns, steel swords, and horses. They and all other Europeans also brought diseases against which the native peoples had no natural defenses. By the end of the 1500s, Spanish soldiers and diseases wiped out many groups of people from Mexico through South America. Change was more gradual for Native Americans in the part of North America that later became the United States. Although the early Spanish explorers built several settlements north of Mexico, they did not conquer all of this land. However, the Spanish were not the only Europeans interested in the Americas. The English, French, Portuguese, and Dutch also crossed the ocean in search of riches. They too sent explorers, and soon they built settlements and colonies of their own. The English settled at Jamestown, Virginia, where they built a fort in 1607 CE. There, Captain John Smith met Pocahontas and her tribe, the Powhatan. A few years later, in 1620 CE, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. They interacted with the Wampanoag people, including a man named Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, who helped them learn to survive. The Pilgrims were grateful to Squanto for his help. According to some historical records, the Pilgrims and Native Americans came together for a meal to share the bounty of their harvest. Today we remember and celebrate this meal as Thanksgiving. As with the story of Columbus, the story of Thanksgiving is only a fragment of a much larger story about Native Americans and the impact Europeans had on their world. Unfortunately, the themes of the Thanksgiving story, such as cooperation, friendship, and gratitude, are not common in the history of relations between Native Americans and Europeans. A changing world, East and West. If you were a Native American boy or girl born somewhere on the Great Plains during the 1500s or 1600s, European explorers existed mainly in rumors and campfire tales. In other words, most Plains tribes did not meet many Europeans at first, but they probably did hear stories about them. Where did these stories come from? Native Americans usually traded with neighboring tribes. Each tribe had something that another tribe needed. They traded animal furs, plants and herbs, pottery, jewelry, and tools or weapons made from various stones, bones, wood, or shells. Whenever they traded things, they also talked and shared news and stories that they heard from other tribes. Around the fire at night, they shared stories of strange men from distant lands. Some said these men came from the sea itself, while others told of giant sailing ships. These strange men had beards, and they wore metal armor on their bodies. They carried powerful weapons that made the sound of thunder echo through the forests and canyons. They also rode on great beasts called horses. Native Americans had never seen any of these things before Europeans arrived. On the other hand, change was somewhat swifter for tribes in the East. From Florida all the way up to Maine and Canada, ships carrying eager and adventurous Europeans arrived. They came from England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and other countries. They did not come simply to explore the land, hunt for valuable furs, and take treasure back to their homes in the so-called Old World. They came to stay. For Eastern tribes, life became very challenging as Europeans moved in and established farms, towns, and cities. European settlers were interested in two things even more valuable than furs. First, they needed knowledge to aid their survival, which Native Americans had in great supply. Native Americans showed settlers how to grow native plants like corn, beans, and tobacco. They taught them where to hunt for their own beaver, bear, and buffalo hides. They taught them the secrets of the forests and mountains and rivers. They also taught them about other tribes. Second, settlers wanted land. English settlers established 13 colonies on the East Coast. Over time, the Native American tribes in these areas lost most of their land, or were forced to move to reservations as European settlers built farms, roads, towns, factories, and cities. Gradually, the settlers ventured away from the East Coast and over the Appalachian Mountains. They encountered the vast landscape of the American West. To them, it must have seemed like a land of opportunity, as such expansion and settlement was no longer possible in Europe. Native Americans trading with each other. Europeans trading with Native Americans. In 1776, those 13 colonies became the United States, and its government had a plan to make the new nation strong and powerful. The U.S. government seized land where Native American tribes lived. Many tribes fought back, but they could not prevent their land from being taken. The Cherokee people, for example, were one of the last large, powerful tribes in the woodlands of the southeastern United States. As the United States expanded its reach during the early 1800s, more and more settlers moved onto Cherokee lands, creating tensions that boiled over into war. The Cherokee tried to adapt to life as farmers and live according to the laws of the United States. Ultimately, though, the U.S. government, under President Andrew Jackson, decided there was no room for the Cherokee or any other tribes. With the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Cherokee and other tribes east of the Mississippi River were forced to move west to newly established Indian Territory in what would later become Oklahoma. Thousands of Cherokee and other Native Americans died on the long walk westward, a journey remembered today as the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee experience, including the tension, wars, and forced relocation to reservation land, was a narrative that played out again and again with other Native American tribes during the 1800s. Eventually, most tribes in the present-day United States, including the tribes of the Great Plains, experienced a similar fate. As you will learn, there are many sad, tragic chapters in the Native American story. The Native American way of life, which had existed for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, was seriously threatened. Fortunately, however, Native American cultures did not vanish. Although it was not easy, many Native American tribes did survive and redefined themselves to become part of a new nation, the United States. Their age-old traditions are still celebrated, and they still walk upon the land they love. Horses. The Spanish brought many horses from Europe. They traded some horses to Native Americans, but many more simply escaped into the wild. Native Americans learned to train and ride horses. Horses eventually transformed a way of life for many tribes. This was especially true on the Great Plains, where horses made hunting, traveling, and fighting much easier. Forced relocation of the Cherokee.